Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Michael, for sharing this session, and thank you, Anna, Christy, Susan, for sharing this session with me. I'm Dr. Gulnaz Anjum. I'm a senior researcher of climate change and migration at University of Oslo. The topic of my presentation today in this session is epistemic inequality and limits of global climate psychology. My key argument today is that climate psychology has a geography problem and that this geography problem is a knowledge problem, which creates epistemic inequality, privileges certain narratives, and overlooks others. So, before any study even runs, a field has already answered at least these three questions. First, what gets studied? Secondly, whose experiences supply the default subject? And which solutions our models make thinkable? My claim in this talk today is to answer or find the answers that track geography of knowledge production, but not necessarily that in doing so, we are also working on geography of climate harm. So the global north, as we know, it produces most of the carbon emissions. And when I say global north, I don't necessarily mean that it's just the geographical location. It is also the historical perspectives, nations who have been either settler nations or colonizers. And when I think about global south, contemporary global south particularly, it lives some of the sharpest impacts of climate change. And today I treat that claim as also empirical one. And I share some of the data and some of the studies that we have been working on in this particular context. So let's first start with the field itself. With my colleagues here at University of Oslo in Pakistan and a few other universities, we have been able to map climate psychology's knowledge base. And in doing so, we have been doing some narrative reviews, some systematic reviews, and specifically this one, it was based on a bibliometric analysis of 3,087 publications, which ranged from 1995 to 2024. We see that the production is very much concentrated in the global north countries, especially the US with 32% of its ranking, then UK 21%, Germany 14%, and Australia at 11%. In all of this, we also see the other side where less than 5% of this knowledge comes from the Global South institution, despite the fact that some of these places in the world are hardest hit with climate change and climate impacts. And we notice also the vocabulary that is being used in this narrative building. So we see that pro-environmental behavior, it appears as a key author word in many of these studies, and especially when it comes to compared to climate justice or anything that is related to equity or inclusion, it is roughly 150 times more represented than any other terms that would be more about climate justice or anything that we can categorize around climate justice. So this also suggests us that the field's language is what it thinks climate change is and whose narratives are included and whose narratives are excluded. Just to showcase one of the figures from this study, this is the field's co-authorship network, which is for the top 55 countries. It's straight from one of our papers, and you can find the links in this presentation. So every line is a collaboration link. So you can see who sits at the center, as you can see. The circles that you see, they are representative and proportional to the contribution of these countries. So you see that who connects through whom. It's also about the networks that are being made. So this is also the architecture that is behind everything that follows. So this is the state of affairs when we look at the global landscape of climate psychology. So what if we looked at the topics within the Global South agenda or Global South climate research? So to study that, we did another research where we're looking at who talks about climate migrants and specifically in the global south. And in this particular research, we see similar architecture. So, despite keeping the focus in our research terms on the global south, we find only 204 studies of climate induced migration within the global south. Interestingly, we see that, China, India, Bangladesh, these are some of the countries where we see now more knowledge being produced on these aspects. But then there is also the question about whose knowledge gets recognized. So, in that sense, that recognition does not follow the volume. So, when it comes to citation of the same studies, then the US leads by 37.6 average citations per article compared to countries like China, India, and many others in the global south. And also, very interestingly, the South to South partnership, it also remains quite marginal. And usually, whenever it is there, it is brokered through the Global North institutions. So, as we wrote in this particular paper, the evidence and frames, they travel along very unequal corridors of influence, right? So, even when there is knowledge production happening, we see that much of that concentration stays in the Global North. Even when it happens in the Global South on Global South topics, still the citations, they go more for the Global North institutions or Global North based papers compared to the Global South papers. So I think it's also then important to understand what are the mechanisms behind this. So these patterns are reproduced through three particular mechanisms. We discuss more of this in one of our chapters in the upcoming book. But many of these, they go back, first of all, to colonial histories, what Farhana Sultana calls climate coloniality, where Global South, it kind of becomes a supply site for data while agendas, credit, and theory accumulation, it is still very much based in the global north. Second, academic gatekeeping is another major issue where language editing or language indexing and journal economics, citation practices, all of that then again filter who enters the record at all. And thirdly, we also think that the methodological hierarchies, they still persist, especially positivist designs. They count for more rigor. They are seen as more rigorous compared to participatory, indigenous, and some of the faith-informed ways of knowing, thinking, which are still continued to be discounted. So these results, they kind of treat Northern scholarship and positivist scholarship as universal, whereas Southern or more participatory and indigenous scholarship as particular cases. So these are the mechanisms that also have consequences on what kind of knowledge is being produced. So, one of the first consequences is basically that the fields default to the individuals, right? So, for example, when we think about carbon footprints, when we think about nudges, when we think about green consumption, the focus is almost always on the individual. So, we read this as governance and as a call for responsibility, power, justice nexus, which is RPJ nexus. And the responsibility in this particular paper on this research, we attribute it is as displaced from the states and the firms to individuals, while the richest, like, one person, they can emit about 16% of global carbon dioxide. And still, the power stays very asymmetric in a sense that people may choose within markets, while power over systems, it still stays concentrated. And in that particular angle, then the justice, it fails because low emitters, especially if we think about the cases in the global south or also the diversity within the global north, where some communities are marginalized, and those low emitters, they are the ones who will carry the burden And the market participation, it substitutes for the political participation. So it seems like, there is kind of this movement and the push towards responsibilizing individual without giving them more power and autonomy. And in that sense, the movement appears without creating any transformation. Another aspect that I would really like to touch upon is that there is plenty of diversity of climate perspectives and perceptions within the global south. So the second consequence is also then the misalignment with the lived realities. With some of my colleagues in Pakistan and in some of the Greek islands, we ran this Q methodology study in Dera Ghazi Khan in southern Punjab in Pakistan with multiple smallholder farmers. So within a given community, you would also see these other layers, for example, gendered perceptions that are like, some of the global things that would also then create other mechanisms within the countries and within the global south communities. For example, when we were talking to women, they would always highlight the infrastructural deficit, the funding gaps, the health risk gaps, and also like, the damages to their food systems because of climate change. And essentially, they would always kind of link adaptation capacity to systemic reforms. However, almost every time when we were speaking with men in the same communities, they had kind of greater confidence in technocratic or market solutions, though they were often overlooking the structural constraints. So when we say or we think about climate change and the impacts and perceptions in the global south, various communities and various subsets within those communities, they also have very different lived experiences. So I think it's important to include these diversified lived experiences in climate psychology debates. So, what would an epistemically just climate psychology then require us to do? We think that there are three working principles. One, methodological pluralism. We need to widen what counts as rigorous science in psychology or evidence. And we need to build multilingual reviews because English only indexing itself is almost a sampling the scene. Second, we need to go more equitably towards equitable knowledge co-production. And we need to move Global South scholars, just like, from data collectors or providers to more agenda setters. And lastly, we need to focus more on the community-centered frameworks, which bring me to the last framework, which is about how to reconnect psychological insights to structure and policy. This is one of the frameworks that we develop as C-frame. It is focused on structural rather than just the individual. And we think that the collective model of climate adaptation that counters the individualistic bias in our field, that is really necessary. And it grows from the evidence that we had from 24-hour risk project in Kenya and in Pakistan, where we show how daily life in global south, it means constant layered ecological environmental exposure. And many times individual is too weak or too vulnerable in a given context, and state might not be strong or powerful enough in order to like, mitigate some of these climate risks. And then in these situations, practices of community and connective care, they become really important for communities' survival. So repositioning people as political agents inside the collective structures, I think that is what would reconnect psychological insights to the structural change that we need. I think I'm at the last minute, so I would also give a bit of a shout out. If you're interested in some of these ideas and topics, as many of them, they have been raised in our upcoming second edition of Climate Psychology book, which is Psychology and Climate Change, which is edited by Michael, Susan, Christie, and myself. And lastly, I think I would really like to close where I began. So, epistemic justice is not just an ethical add on, it is a scientific necessity for effective climate action, and especially for global effective climate action. And as a field that changes who produces knowledge, that is the only way where we will change what we know about our own field. So thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your questions, and please reach out to me via email at gulnaz.anjum@psychology.uio.no. The psychology part is in Norwegian. Thank you everyone for joining this session, and thanks to my colleagues in this room who have organized this session. If you have questions, I'm sure Michael and Susan, they will also be able to answer on my behalf. If not, please feel free to reach out to me via this email address. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.